On a quiet spring morning in 1999, Jill Dando, the original true crime presenter of the UK, became a victim in her very own unsolved murder case. She was killed on the doorstep of her London home in broad daylight by a shadowy figure in a long dark coat. Jill's murder was executed with skilled precision and careful planning. It was clearly no random act of violence. In fact, is that what it was? An execution? Jill used her voice to bring attention to a lot of horrific crimes happening around the world. Maybe she'd gotten too loud and ended up pissing off the wrong people. Jill was the golden girl of British TV in the 90s. She was a BBC presenter, meaning that she appeared on half of all of the TV channels at the time. People considered her to be like TV's Princess Diana. But when Jill was senselessly murdered, her case became the largest investigation in the history of the Met Police since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. How could the nation's sweetheart be murdered in cold blood on her own doorstep without the killer leaving so much as a trace of evidence? Maybe Jill Dando had angered the wrong people. Today we're uncovering all the strange and terrifying theories surrounding Jill's death. This series is intended for educational purposes, to memorialise victims and to amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. Before we get into the episode, I want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, listening.com. As you guys know, or can probably tell from watching even more than one of my videos, I am really into researching weird, bizarre things on the internet. Honestly, my brain is just full of the most random facts ever. And as someone who is always on the move, I am always looking for ways to multitask and be able to get in my research while I'm doing other things. I'm a busy girl. Imagine what a game changer it could be if you could listen to academic papers, textbooks, PDFs, or even web pages while you're on the go. And that's exactly why I love today's sponsor, listening.com. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. Listening.com, all you have to do is listen and it will narrate to you anything that you want to read, which completely frees up your hands. I love it. I don't have to hold a book. Or for you super studiers out there, you can listen to the audio whilst also following along visually, and maybe that'll help the information sink in more. But I'm not gonna lie, my main use for listening.com is so that I can multitask, so that I can listen to case files and reports while doing the housework. I'll be honest with you girls, it's not glamorous, but it's real. A real girl boss needs to find ways to efficiently multitask. Listening.com can also read you math equations, it can automatically skip citations in academic papers, and it can even help you to pronounce tricky words, which is one of my favorite things. I do cases from all over the world, names and place names and I don't know, just different terms, different colloquialisms from all over the world, and sometimes I sound like a fool in these videos when I pronounce things wrong, so I'm so thankful for that feature. Another thing I love is the one-click note-taking feature where you can just press the little plus note button at the bottom and it will instantly save that sentence to a notepad for you. And this is especially handy for me in those like frustrating moments where I remember a detail about a case but I can't remember where I've read it. If I've saved it to my notepad, then I can actually like go back into the original piece of text that I found it from. It's perfect. Honestly, if you're a student, you need this. You need this. I don't know where it was when I was in school, but I'm glad it's there for the younger generation. I sound really old saying that, don't I? But listening.com can be useful for anyone and everyone, especially if you spend a lot of your time commuting or even working out, running or something, and you want something to listen to. The point is, you don't have to be sat at your desk to be able to get your reading in. You can do it absolutely anywhere. And there's a special offer just for you guys. Of course there is. If you go to the link down below in the description, or if you go to listening.com/Eleanor Neale, you can get an extra week for free. So thanks again to listening.com for sponsoring this video. This episode will cover a lot of sensitive topics, including discussions of rape, stalking, war crimes, and murder. so viewer discretion is advised. Do click out now if you think you need to. So today's case takes place in Fulham in West London in 1999. On the morning of April 26th, the nation's sweetheart Jill Dando was tragically murdered on her doorstep in broad daylight. She was just 37 years old. She was Britain's biggest TV personality at that time. She was beloved and recognised by pretty much everyone in this nation. But Jill's story actually started from much humbler beginnings. Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9th, 1961 in the seaside town of Weston-super-Mare in the southwest of England. She had one older brother that was actually 11 years older than her, so quite a big age gap, and for that reason the two of them weren't very close growing up. I guess they just didn't have a lot in common. But the two of them did share a lot of happy memories of going for picnics and going to the beach as a family. But before that, there was Jill as a baby and all of the severe health complications that she had as a toddler. Around the time that she was learning to walk, her parents noticed that her cheeks were always really red and flushed where they hadn't been when she was just a baby. It was a bit peculiar, but it became actually concerning when she began trying to run around. She'd only just learnt to walk, so now she was trying to run, and she would get out of breath so quickly. Just running across the room would have her completely out of breath, and her parents knew that this couldn't be normal. They took Jill to the doctors, and they agreed that this wasn't normal, but with all the tests that they were doing, they couldn't quite figure out why this was happening. I think there were quite a few appointments that she had to go to and have different tests done, and no one could give her family answers. It was an incredibly difficult time for her family. They had no idea what the issue was, no professionals could help them, and they didn't know how they could help their little girl. The anxiety that they must have been feeling at that point in time must have been unbearable. Thankfully though, doctors eventually gave an answer to this problem, although it wasn't a good answer. It turns out that Jill had actually been born with the issue that she was experiencing right now, but it was only just becoming apparent now that she could move and walk and run. So actually, when she was born, Jill had been a blue baby, was known as a blue baby, and that's because they literally look blue due to like a lack of oxygen in their blood. Their lips, their skin will have like this bluish tinge. And they're just finding out now, when she's a toddler, that the reason she was blue when she was a baby was because Jill had a very serious congenital heart condition. She had a literal hole in her heart, and one of the arteries leading to her lungs was clogged. If they hadn't discovered these issues when they did, when she was still tiny, then Jill probably would have died as an infant. At just 3 years old, Jill Dando went through an 8-hour surgery on her heart to try to close that hole. And back then, this type of heart surgery was very rare. It was largely experimental. Doctors still didn't quite know what worked. They were still testing things out. This was a new procedure. And she was a 3-year-old baby. Her parents were so scared. But Jill Dando was among the very first survivors of this surgery. And when she came out of the hospital, she actually ran up to her parents, something that she wasn't really able to do before. She ran up to them, and her father said that that was the proudest day of his life. And after that life-saving surgery, Jill lived her life pretty much as any other normal kid. I think she will have had to have a good few checkups after that, but her heart really didn't seem to affect her for the rest of her life, which is great that they can catch things like this and fix them completely when you're so young, and then your body just kind of gets used to a new way of living and a new way of, like, I don't know, internal things happening. I don't know, I find science absolutely mind-blowing. So, Jill is now out of hospital and she's at home, probably doing a lot of recovery. And when she was young, having a TV at home was still a pretty big deal. There were only 3 channels to choose from at the time. That was if you were even lucky enough to own a TV. Not everyone had one. And in Jill Dando's lifetime, she was still only in single digits, but in her lifetime, she had seen TVs turn from black and white to complete colour. And I bet it was so fascinating for kids at that time to kind of watch this new technology arise. Jill Dando was one of those kids that was fixated by the TV. She couldn't take her eyes off the screen. And TVs back then didn't have a lot of variation, I'm sure you can imagine, because there were only 3 channels. They would show a mixture of like news and cartoons on Saturday mornings for the kids. There were, sorry, I just cracked my knuckle. Bad Ellie. Is cracking your knuckles even bad for you though? I'm gonna stop doing it anyway. What I was trying to say is, TV back then brought families together. Now they all complain about like, they all. Who is they all? I don't know. People complain about TV like tearing families apart and technology is like destroying our kids' minds and blah, 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 blah. But back then, it was a social thing. Everyone would gather around this one tiny little shit quality screen to watch like the latest drama. By the time Jill was 8 years old, she was fascinated by the world of TV. When she wasn't actually watching the TV in her house, she was going to the library and checking out every single book on television that she could find. She was fascinated just by this concept that there were real people doing actual things and then it was being broadcasted on her little square in her house. But anyway, as Jill grew into a teenager, she was very devoted to her studies and she was actually voted head girl at her school. And for the confused Americans, head girl is similar to like the student body president. That accent was so bad. Please, Americans, stay subscribed to me. I won't do it again. Jill was very popular at school, and not popular in the mean girls way, popular like in the genuine way where everyone actually liked her. She never took issue with anyone, and no one ever had a reason to dislike Jill Dando. She minded her business and focused on her studies. Both her father and her brother worked as journalists for a local newspaper called the Western Mercury, and this is where Jill got her very first job as a print journalist. At just 18 years old, Jill Dando was the first ever female reporter at the Mercury. We love seeing women smashing those glass ceilings. Back in the 80s, the world of journalism was very much still an all-boys club. I mean, women were there, sure, but they weren't often listened to. They were invisible. They were there just to look good and to fetch a drink. But into this testosterone-fueled arena walked Jill Dando. She wasn't there to make coffees or to fetch copies. She was there to report the news, just like all her male co-workers were, and she was gonna do it damn well. While Jill was working at the Mercury, she also joined the Western Dramatic Society because she had this real passion for acting and performance and theatre. In 1983, she even landed the lead role in an amateur dramatics production of Agatha Christie's A Murder is Announced. This is a theme that comes up quite a bit in this case, is a lot of like eerie foreshadowing in Jill Dando's life. She appeared in an Agatha Christie murder mystery when she was young. Later on in life, she started to produce a true crime TV show. I mean, I don't really have much more to say about that. That's just a pattern that I've noticed that's quite interesting and a bit eerie. But then again, if I was to die in suspicious circumstances, mine would be like 10 times worse than this. I've got like a whole YouTube channel about murder. But anyway, back to Jill Dando. Her like stage experience and the Agatha Christie production really helped her come into her own like as a performer. And I know that later in life she ended up being a presenter, which is not exactly the same thing, but becoming a performer in a theatrical sense will have given her a lot of stage presence and confidence and skills like enunciation, different little skills like that were building even when she was a teenager. In 1985, after working for 5 years at the Western Mercury newspaper, Jill landed her very first job at the BBC. BBC standing for British Broadcasting Corporation, that is. Part of this new role actually required Jill to move away from home because now she would be delivering news bulletins for BBC Radio Devon, based in Plymouth. So at 23 years old, Jill left her hometown and went off to chase her dreams. And of course, being the social butterfly that she'd always been, she found it very easy to settle in and integrate into her new environment. Later that same year, she made the big jump from radio to TV for the very first time. She was still based in like BBC Devon, but now she was put on a TV news show called Spotlight, which was their local news. Jill was excellent at this job, and everyone that worked with her at this point in time knew that she was destined for big things. But her big break came in May of 1988 when she was offered the opportunity to present BBC's Breakfast Time. I said that as if there was going to be a big reaction from the audience, but honestly I think this was way before most of you guys' time. So maybe I'll have to explain the impact of that one. Bear in mind, there were very few channels. At this point in time, there were 4. There was one more channel. Ooh, lucky them. But she was now the main morning presenter for one of 4 channels. That meant that so many people were going to watch her face every single morning. Watch her face, watch her, see her face. She had jumped from being just this little regional news presenter to now waking up the whole entire nation pretty much with this major breakfast show. And that was all in the space of like 3 years. She was making major career moves. Very, very inspirational. But Jill Dando almost didn't take that job on BBC's Breakfast Time. The job that changed her whole entire life, she almost turned it down. And that was because she loved her previous job as being just a local small news reporter in Devon. She found it so incredibly rewarding to be one of the little guys, you know, that was out there day to day in the streets, getting to know the people of her community and reporting for them. She'd gotten really used to this sense of community and this way of working as well. This was a very small setup that she was in at the moment, and she didn't want to lose all of that like close-knit feeling by moving to London and working in a like mega high production TV studio. But in the end, she realized that opportunities like this might only come around once in a lifetime, and she would kick herself later on down the line if she never gave it a go. So after giving it a lot of thought and asking a lot of people for a lot of different advice, Jill Dando thought, screw it, I'm moving to London. And so at the age of 26, she moved to the big smoke. And from the very start of her new gig, it was so clear that Jill absolutely shone on screen. She had this special talent for connecting with people, even through a screen, which is quite hard to do. She would just radiate warmth and good, comforting energy into people's living rooms, and people felt like they could really relate to this woman. She was an every woman. And soon, Jill's talent would catch the eye of Bob Wheaton, the BBC editor for the 6 o'clock news. He was a pretty powerful man in the world of TV. He had a lot of connections, and he was certainly someone that could change the course of Jill's career. Although Bob was very influential at the BBC, he wasn't technically Jill's boss yet. At this point in time, they worked on separate programs, but he did still have a lot of influence in their sector. This was a man that she wanted to be on the good side of. And one day, while he was preparing for the evening news that he worked on, he was watching the morning news that Jill worked on, and he was mesmerized by this woman. He thought that she was a total natural on screen, and she really had the face for TV. But leave it to a man with an overinflated ego to find a flaw in a talented woman like Jill. He thought she had potential, but he wasn't fully satisfied with how she looked. He described her as having arrived from the provinces looking like a regional girl, which basically meant that she looked too plain, too ordinary to be on TV. There was nothing special about her. And so he decided, out of the kindness of his heart, that he was going to change that. After taking a long, hard look at Jill, Bob told her that she just didn't look right. He said, you need to sort your hair out. You need to wear the right clothes. And it actually gets worse. A bit later on, Bob told her that she had put on weight that she needed to lose, which absolutely infuriated me to hear, especially because this had never been a criticism used against Jill Dando, like ever before, really. She'd been on TV for years at this point. There were so many videos, so many photos, so many news articles about her, yet no one ever seemed to pick out her weight as a defining feature about her other than Bob Wheaton. But Jill wanted to continue growing her career, so she listened to Bob's advice. After all, he was higher up in the BBC than her, so maybe he did know best. And maybe there was a part of her that felt like she didn't really have a choice. While this wasn't her boss exactly, he was still very high up in the company that she worked at, and if he wanted to put in a bad word, I'm sure that would have a huge effect on her career. And of course, Jill wanted to keep this job. It was her dream job, and she was finally starting to see her flowers. So she made some changes to her appearance, including getting in touch with the same hairdresser that Princess Diana had. And Princess Diana was famous for her hair. She had that short, blonde, like straight, sleek bob. It was very unique, and this was gonna be a big jump for Jill Dando, mind you. She had like brown, curly, long hair before this. They were changing everything about it. The cut, the colour, the texture. It was a total rebrand. And now she too was very famous for this particular haircut. The two most famous and adored women in the whole of the UK were rocking the exact same hair. Can you imagine what that did to the young women of the time? Yes, this hair became the new it girl accessory. Everyone was taking photos of Jill Dando or Princess Diana to their hairdresser. But this makeover actually very nearly didn't happen. Jill got in contact with the hairdresser, got all the way down to the salon, chatted through a potential hairstyle with this guy, and then right as he was about to cut her hair off, Jill hesitated and said, wait, should I ask my producer, aka Bob Wheaton? What, just to check if she was still allowed to make changes to her own body? It seems that Bob had well and truly got his claws into Jill. She listened to and followed his every word. And it wasn't long after this that the two of them actually began dating. Now, we don't know exactly when their relationship shifted from a business one to a romantic one, partly because they kept it a secret. On purpose. They knew that this relationship wouldn't be looked upon very favourably at work, what with him being her boss and her being 14 years younger than him. I mean, there was a clear power imbalance here that was already proving itself in the way that he was changing this woman's whole entire appearance. I think Jill was around 27, 28 years old at this point in time, but this relationship is really hard to pinpoint because they did keep it a secret, so we don't know exactly when it began. But frustratingly, Bob Wheaton was kind of right about this whole makeover thing because Jill's new look completely transformed her into one of the biggest style icons of the 90s. Everyone was drawing comparisons between her and Princess Diana, the literal people's princess, which is the ultimate compliment for any woman of that time, or of this time. I would cry if someone called me the people's princess. The two of them just had a very similar nature that was very sweet and genuine and nurturing, comforting. There was a reason that the British public got so attached to these two women just from seeing them through a screen, and that was because they were really, really easy to like. So it's no shock that Jill's murder hit everyone so hard, almost as hard as when Princess Diana died. And this is another comparison between them. They both had such tragic, sudden ends, and both of their deaths are still filled with so many unanswered questions, and it feels as though powerful men in this country were at the heart of both of these women's pain. I do want to do a whole deep dive into Princess Diana and just her story from start to finish, so if you do want to see that at some point in the Freaky Friday series, let me know. P.S. if you didn't know, we have another series on this channel. This is the True Crime series, and we have Freaky Friday, where we talk about a bunch of like weird, disturbing cases where no one necessarily gets murdered, but weird shit happens anyway. But anyway, back to this case. In 1991, just 3 years after Jill had moved to London to become a TV presenter, she covered her first breaking news story on the 6 o'clock news. That afternoon, she'd been out for a late lunch with her boyfriend at the time, Bob Wheaton, who was, of course, the editor of that show. They'd just gotten back to BBC Studios and they were getting ready for the show that night when the news broke of the 1991 coup in the Soviet Union. A coup is basically when a group of people try to overthrow the government by force. And when the BBC received this news, it was down to Jill to jump into action as the main presenter of the news at 6 and deliver this story to the whole country. This was a massive moment in her career. Remember, there were only about 3 channels at the time, so practically everyone in the whole entire country sat and watched this breaking news. Jill Dando was well and truly a household name at this point, but behind the scenes, her personal life revealed a much darker side than her polished persona ever revealed. Jill's agent, John Roseman, described her relationship with her boyfriend, Bob Wheaton, as strange, and he wasn't the only one. Obviously, Bob was 14 years older than Jill. he was her boss, he was known to have quite a controlling nature. The two of them actually dated for 7 years, which is longer than I expected when I started looking into this case, not gonna lie. They eventually broke up when I think Jill was about 34 years old. And apparently this was a mutual decision due to their like super hectic work schedules. The two of them wanted to focus on their careers. They agreed to stay friends, stay in each other's lives. It was supposedly very amicable. But Jill's career only continued to skyrocket this whole entire time. Soon she was offered a presenting job for a travel show called Holiday. And this was an absolute dream job. I'm so jealous of her for having this job. She got to just travel around and visit the most beautiful locations that this planet has to offer. From beaches to forests to mountains to like wildlife nature reserves. She saw everything on this show. What a dream come true. She had such a blast making this show and the audience had such a blast watching it. The show had already existed before Jill presented it, but with her presenting, she absolutely blew it up. Each episode of this show now had about 10 million average viewers. Now that is crazy. Around this same time, she picked up another presenting job, potentially the job that she is best known for, the job that I know her for very well. Not that I was alive at the time, but I have like since watched back clips. Guys, come on, it was Crimewatch. I am a true crime girly through and through. I have gone back and I have watched Jill Dando episodes of Crimewatch. She was the blueprint. Long before there were true crime girlies like me on the internet, people were glued to their TV sets to watch shows like Crimewatch. They would broadcast current news updates and current crime updates specifically of different things that needed solving or different updates in crimes or things to be aware of. Like, I just think it was such a brilliant show. On the show, Jill would talk about unsolved murders, mysterious crimes, missing people. They would have the police themselves come on the show to give appeals and to discuss cases, to discuss ways to keep yourself safe. And whenever they would discuss these cases, they would have like a little tip line running on the bottom of the screen that you could call up if you knew anything about what they were talking about. I think it's just such a brilliant concept. Such a way to help the community solve its own crimes rather than trusting and believing that the police will do it, because they won't a lot of the time. The show was briefly cancelled in 2017 and I was heartbroken. I was devastated, but it has recently made a comeback on BBC and I haven't watched it yet, not gonna lie, I don't really watch TV that much, but if any of you have seen it while it's been back, let me know what it's like. Do I have to tune in? Crimewatch has proven to be a very, very helpful show, and a lot of the cases that Jill would present would end up being solved or arrests would be made. And actually we've covered quite a few cases on this channel that were featured on Crimewatch back in the day. Do you remember the murder of James Bulger? It's a really, really sad one that I covered years and years and years ago. I'm not even entirely sure the video is still on this channel. But basically, in February 1993, there was this 2-year-old boy named James Bulger. He was walking around this shopping centre with his mum when she let go of his hand for a brief moment, and he was lured away by 2 older boys. John Venables and Robert Thompson were only 10 years old themselves at the time, but they proceeded to inflict one of the worst torture and murder cases I've ever heard of in my entire life. They abducted this little boy and took him away to the railway, and I'm not going to go into any more detail with that case. It is absolutely traumatic, so be careful if you look it up in your own time. In your own time, as if this is like a class that I'm putting on. But as they had abducted him out of this shopping centre, they'd been caught on a lot of CCTV cameras, and this footage was put out onto Crimewatch. People were asked to call in if they knew either of these boys, and actually, this is what led to them being identified. Crimewatch. The show has really, really helped to bring justice to a lot of people, not just murder victims, but people, victims of crimes in general. And it's really, really heartbreaking to me that Jill Dando herself would become one of those unsolved cases that she worked so passionately to help solve. But at this point in her life, Jill was seeing so much success, and I bet her family was so proud of her. And imagine like how her older brother feels about it. How cool would that be to be like, my little sister is like the face of the TV. And by this point, Jill Dando was way more than just a TV presenter. She was a whole entire celebrity. She had magazine covers, awards like BBC's Personality of the Year. But behind all of that fame, she was still just Jill. That very normal girl next door type that everyone loved. And that is why everyone loved her so much, because the fame never changed her. She was still always a girl that you could imagine going for drinks with, or a girl that you could imagine introducing to your friend group. Like, she was an every woman, as I said before. Jill was 35 years old when she was introduced to a man named Alan Farthing through some mutual friends. Alan seemed like a great man. He was a doctor, and Jill fell from him literally like from the day that she met him. And 2 years later, in January of 1999, the couple announced their engagement. Jill said that she had never been happier. Their wedding was booked for September of that year, and she even saw them having kids very soon after. But tragically, Jill Dando would be gunned down and killed within a split second, less than 5 months after that proposal. On April 26th, 1999, Helen Doble, Jill's neighbour, was walking up Gowan Avenue in Fulham sometime after 11:30 in the morning. Helen crossed the road and she saw Jill's car, and then she saw her front door, and then she saw Jill lying in a pool of blood on her own front doorstep. She panicked, of course, and called for an ambulance, telling them confidentially, "It looks like it's Jill Dando." Ambulances arrived at the scene to find that blood was streaming from Jill's nose. Her arms were already blue, and it seemed that she hadn't been breathing for a while. She was transported to Charing Cross Hospital, but at 1:03 p.m, doctors pronounced Jill Wendy Dando dead on arrival. She was 37 years old. Just a few minutes later, her friend and colleague Jenny Bond had to announce her death live on the BBC. Watching Jenny present the news of Jill's death just completely breaks my heart. And she was so professional all the way through it. She was so brave, and then just at the very end you can hear her voice break a little bit. Like, just imagine the energy in that newsroom when they received the bulletin, and not only were they all suddenly finding out that one of their own had been killed, murdered, but now they have to very quickly pull themselves together, put a brave face on, go out there and be very formal, speak to the whole entire nation about your friend that has just tragically lost their life. As if they're not all horrified and devastated and shocked and speechless, and then to have to just put all that aside for business. It's just so heartbreaking on so many levels. And after this broadcast went out to the whole entire country, floods of tributes were coming in from everyone, from fans, from people that just loved watching her on the TV, to other celebrities, to politicians, people like Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and even Queen Elizabeth herself loved Jill Dando. In the breaking news bulletin that Jenny did, she said that Jill had been stabbed to death, but that wasn't actually accurate. I'm not sure why they believed she was stabbed at first, but this was very quickly corrected by the police when they found out that Jill had been shot with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, a type of firearm that actually can't be legally owned here in the UK. The gun had clearly been pressed up against the back of her head when this shot had been fired, and this actually made her injury so severe that, like I say, at the very beginning, police couldn't actually tell if she'd been stabbed or shot. They did actually assume stabbed. But by that night, it was confirmed that Jill had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. And that day, the crime scene was absolutely chaotic. There were multiple paramedics and police crowding the area. Plus, the press were everywhere, and there were no boundaries for this. And of course, with it being the 90s, everyone wasn't quite as forensically aware, so this was an absolute nightmare when it came to forensics contamination. The journalists and the photographers were the worst fucking part of it all, like spilling into the garden and stuff like that. You never know what's going to be in there. You never know if there's evidence or footprints. Like, get off. In all of this chaos, the police failed to secure the area properly, and like I say, it all got contaminated. The police actually blamed the paramedics for this, saying that they were like running around the whole thing. But like, first of all, if anyone's got a fucking right to be running around a crime scene, is it not the paramedics that are trying to save the person? But second of all, you didn't close off the crime scene properly. It's literally your fault. You, the police, that is, not you, the listener. And not taping up the crime scene was just the first of many severe mistakes that police made throughout this case. This investigation was led by Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell, a man that you're probably not gonna like that much by the end of this episode. Trust me, I don't. Granted, he was in a difficult position because this case was gonna be a very difficult one to crack. It was the 90s, first of all. Ring doorbells and security cameras weren't really around yet. Not like personal home security cameras anyway. They weren't that common. So where do you look first? Well, back then, they relied I'm sorry, I'm making it sound like it's way back in the past. Back in the olden days, in the 90s. They relied very heavily on physical evidence that was found at the scene and witness statements. Both of these things they didn't really have in Jill Dando's murder case. There were no eyewitnesses to the event, so that one was written off completely. There was no physical evidence at the scene of the crime other than the bullet and the cartridge. And that's to be expected. So, with not much at the scene to go off, police had to start theorizing practically out of thin air who their killer could possibly be. But that was quite tricky when this murder seemed motiveless. Because think about it, everyone in the whole entire damn country loved Jill Dando. She never got in beef with anyone, she never offended anyone. There was no clear reason why anyone would ever want to kill her. Plus, it's unclear what anyone would stand to gain from killing her anyway. It wasn't like this was a robbery gone wrong, they didn't steal anything off her, they didn't do anything to her. Whoever had done this had literally just come to kill Jill and then get out quick. So, the police decided to question Jill's inner circle first because, well, don't we all know at this point that in a murder case they always look to the friends and family, the partner, because more often than not, people are murdered by someone they already know. And Jill's inner circle included Bob Wheaton, her ex-boyfriend from a pretty toxic relationship. So he was a person of interest right off the bat. Well, for some reason, at this point in time, even though it had been a couple of years, like 3 years since they separated, Bob was still a part of Jill's life. They did both still work for the BBC, so maybe it's understandable they would see each other at work, but they were still friends. And police found out that Bob actually owed Jill quite a bit of money at the time that she died, about £35,000, which is actually about £79,000 in today's money with the inflation and stuff. So maybe there's something of a motive there, like he was in debt to this woman that had left him lonely, and there's a certain type of man out there that could be driven to murder in such a situation. So was Bob Wheaton one of those men? He explained to the police that the debt was left over from when Jill had helped him to buy a house. I think they'd bought a house together actually and lived in it together for a while until they eventually split up and she moved out. So I think it was just kind of left over from that. Bob even showed the police like his different bank accounts and his statements to show them that he wasn't exactly strapped for cash. Remember, he was a BBC editor. He was earning a decent amount of money. This debt that he was in to Jill wasn't exactly a pressing issue in his life. It wasn't stressing him out. It certainly wasn't something that he would commit murder over. And with that, police ruled out Bob Wheaton, Jill's ex-boyfriend. He is no longer a suspect in her murder. Something interesting I do want to point out quite early on is that Jill wasn't actually living in the house that she was murdered in front of. 29 Gowan Avenue, that was her house, but she'd actually been living with her fiancé, Alan, for a while at his house. So she was hardly ever at the Gowan Avenue house, and she very rarely stayed the night. She was always staying over at her boyfriend's house. So this means it would be practically impossible to predict the rare times that she did show up there. For someone to know that Jill was going to be there on Monday morning at 11:30 a.m, surely they must have been following her that morning. I mean, fair enough if this was a regular routine that she had and they could have been observing her for a while, but it wasn't. This was a very out-of-the-blue trip that she made to her house. Either someone knew she was going there or someone had followed her there from somewhere else. So police were eager to track Jill's movements on the morning of her murder, because if anyone had seen her before she was killed, they might have also seen someone stalking in the shadows behind her. There were over 190 different CCTV cameras in the surrounding streets, which meant the police had to watch 430 hours of footage between two of them. They put 2 police officers on watching all those hours of footage, bless their souls. But eventually they were able to establish a timeline of events on the morning before Jill was killed. At 10:05 a.m, Jill leaves Alan Farthing's home and jumps in her car. At 10:21 a.m, she drives to a petrol station and then heads to Hammersmith Town Centre, which is about a 17-minute drive away from Gowan Avenue, where she would later end up. At 10:50 a.m, Jill goes into at least 2 shops, maybe 3, to buy some fax paper or copying paper. By 11:10 a.m, she's back in her car, and at 11:31 a.m, she parks her car outside her house at 29 Gowan Avenue and walks up the path to her front door. Before she could even reach to open her front door, a gun was pressed to the back of her head and she was shot and killed. She had no idea that it was coming. Just 1 minute, she was here living her life, and the next, she was lying in a pool of blood on her own doorstep. Having this timeline of events pieced together meant that police could watch Jill as she went about her morning, and they really couldn't seem to find anyone that was stalking her or following her. There was no one that appeared in more than one location. So maybe she wasn't being actively, physically stalked that morning, but still, her killer must have known that she was going to be at that house that morning, somehow, even if they weren't following her. Maybe they were posted up at the house all day, just like laying in wait, knowing that she would arrive home at some point, and they were just waiting for that time to come. So, police did some digging and tried to figure out who in her life knew Jill's schedule, or even like her spontaneous schedule. And there was actually only one person that knew that she was going to be at Gowan Avenue that day, and that was her agent, John Roseman. In fact, the only reason Jill went to Gowan Avenue that morning is because John had sent her some faxes, and you know how fax machines be, they're not portable, so she had to go back to her house to go and collect her faxes. Just in case you don't know what a fax machine is, I am going to explain, and I'm sorry for those of you that I make feel very, very old right now. I'm going to make it worse by saying I've never seen a fax machine with my own 2 eyes, but I'm going to explain what one is now. Faxes are basically like the olden way of sending a text message. I'm really sorry. You would basically scan your document into a fax machine, like a physical piece of paper document. You would dial the number of another fax machine, and then it would like send off. It would send through the phone line, through the air particles, and then it would print out on the other side. I mean, thank God we have iPhones now, am I right? But the point is, he'd sent her a message that morning, and she was going home to be able to collect that message. He was the only one that knew she was heading back to Gowan Avenue. So, who is John Roseman? Shall we have a chat about him? He was 49 years old at this point in time, and he had a bit of a reputation. He was known as a very funny, crazy, silly, colourful, over-the-top, straight-talking guy, didn't take himself too seriously. He was quite the character, but he was also quite the businessman, and there are a couple of rumours floating around about this guy and about his business practices, I guess. Basically, one of the rumours is that he once turned up to someone's house with a baseball bat just to kind of make a point, I guess. Threaten them, maybe, allegedly, perhaps. I don't know, I wasn't there. But here's where John Roseman starts getting a little bit suspicious, maybe. He had spent the last 4 years writing a book. This book was called Good Men Die Like Dogs. It was about an agent, just like him, actually, whose clients kept getting murdered under mysterious circumstances. And just like Jill Dando, the first victim in the book was murdered with a single gunshot to the head. John had written a novel that was disturbingly similar to what had actually happened in real life. Although there were some important differences that I need you to know of, that all the victims in his book were male. Jill Dando was not male. John was never like a seedy character. He was never suspicious or uncooperative. Police did actually kind of like him. He gave them a manuscript of this book when they asked to see it, and they read through it, and when they eventually gave him it back, they said that it was good. It was a good book. After questioning him, DCI Campbell just discounted John Roseman as a suspect. He didn't think that he had anything to do with Jill Dando's murder. So, on to the next. The police decided that maybe it wasn't someone in Jill's immediate circle. Maybe it wasn't someone she knew all that well anyway. I mean, after all, she was a celebrity, so there are a lot of people that know of her and might want to target her for different reasons. She doesn't necessarily know them. So they started thinking about like witness statements and, well, as close as they could get to witness statements, because like I said, no one actually saw anything happen really. But there was one person that said they heard a scream kind of around 11:30-ish, and that makes sense. It probably was Jill screaming. Or was it actually? I am now just realising that she was shot in the back of the head. Do you think she would have had time to scream or something? Maybe it was the lady that found her body. Maybe she screamed before she called the police and the ambulance. Something important to note actually about that scream is that there wasn't a gunshot sound like directly before it. And this could be for a couple of different reasons. Maybe it's because the scream wasn't Jill Dando when she was getting murdered, or maybe like the gun had a silencer on it. But like I said, there were no eyewitnesses to the murder, but there were actually a couple of people that described seeing a man in his late 30s or 40s. He was quite tall, about 5'11", 180 centimetres. He had dark hair and he was wearing a long dark coat, like 3/4 length down to his legs kind of coat. This man had been spotted coming out of a park near where Jill lived. He was spotted waiting for a bus near where Jill lived. But I don't know, like, maybe he was just a man. Things like this kind of give me a bit of a giggle, because what are the reasons that people were suspicious of this man over any other person that they saw that day? Is it because of the long coat? Is it because of the long coat? Wait, guys, so I've been doing a bit of digging, because I was actually really intrigued by the long coat thing, and I have realised that the Columbine massacre took place 6 days before Jill Dando's murder, and maybe the long coat thing, maybe people were just suspicious of people in trench coats around that time. Wow. That is totally my own theory. By the way, I've literally just done some Googling and added 2 and 2 together in my brain to make 6. But 7 days after Jill's death, police released an EFIT sketch on the news, a sketch of what they think their suspect looks like. An EFIT is basically a computer-generated image of a criminal based on the descriptions that witnesses give. Now, there weren't very many descriptions of this long coat man, so you can imagine how successful this EFIT was. Police were also really interested in this other witness statement. It was actually from a traffic warden that had been patrolling the area, and she went to put a parking ticket on this blue Range Rover, and there was a guy still sat in it at the time, and he went ballistic on her. She was writing down his license plate number, and he got so mad that she actually stopped. Like, she actually stopped doing her job because she was scared of this man in this car. And this was around the time of Jill's murder, by the way, that both the long coat man was seen and the Range Rover fella got all gobby in his car. So, there's one man that looks like a shooter, and there's another man that seems like he has general anger issues and a lot of frustration, and seemingly doesn't want his license plate noting down. Police tried to appeal for both of these men to come forward for like interviews and stuff like that, but obviously without any names or even faces or anything. They were just like, if you have a blue Range Rover, please come talk to the police. Like, it wasn't easy. It really wasn't easy. And police were very quickly realising that maybe there was a lack of evidence and witnesses for a reason. And maybe that's because whoever had murdered Jill Dando had made sure that it was the most seamless and secret operation possible. Maybe it wasn't just a murder, maybe it was an assassination. The fact that there is such little evidence shows that whoever did this really thought everything through. They made sure that they left nothing, were seen by no one. They managed to be at the right place at the exact right time, again, without being seen or heard by anyone. It's insane to me. It's like they just vanished into thin air. In fact, it wouldn't be totally crazy to theorize that whoever had committed this murder, maybe it wasn't their first murder. It clearly seems as though they know how to get away with one. Jill's murder had all the signs of a professional hit. For example, she was killed with a single shot. There wasn't another bullet fired at all. The accuracy and precision and the confidence of this person, it just seems like they knew what they were doing a little too well. You would think if they weren't a very experienced shooter, then they would fire at least 2 bullets to make sure that one of them hit. Other potential signs that this could have been a professional hit is that the gun touched the back of Jill's head, remember? And this is something that's done often like in professional hits for like executions, where they are making sure that that person is not going to survive beyond that one bullet. Obviously, hitmen are paid a fucking lot of money to do what they do. I said that like it's like an actual job that you can apply for. I can only imagine the amount of money that they would get for like one job. And if you're getting that amount of money, you've got to make sure that that person is dead. Plus, all of this happened in broad daylight, in the middle of the day, without a single witness. Honestly, if it wasn't for the body, you wouldn't have known this happened. No one heard anything or saw anyone. Clearly, the person that killed Jill knew how to do so very quickly and without being seen or heard. So the police started to consider that her death could have been a professional hit. A hitman got her. Which actually brings us back to her work as a true crime reporter on Crimewatch. If you think about Crimewatch from the criminal's perspective, that is a problem. That is a huge problem that needs to be dealt with, because as long as Crimewatch exists, it is so much harder for them to get away with their crimes. So what if Jill's murder was because of something that she'd said or reported on Crimewatch, or just in general, the fact that she reports crimes to the whole country? I bet there's a lot of people that that doesn't sit very well with. What if it was some like criminal gang that shot and killed Jill Dando to make a statement to Crimewatch? Stop reporting these crimes, stop digging your nose in, or people will die. I find this theory very interesting, that Jill could have been murdered as an act of revenge for her job, for presenting Crimewatch. In fact, in the Netflix documentary on Jill's murder, there was a criminal that they interviewed, and he was saying that there were whispers in the criminal world around the time of Jill's death that someone had been paid to kill her. He didn't want to say much more to this documentary for fears of his own safety, but he all but confirmed that it was a professional hit. But why shoot the messenger, is the exact words that Jill's co-presenter on Crimewatch used when he was talking to the police. He just didn't feel like this theory had a very strong motive. After all, it was hardly like Jill Dando was foiling big mob bosses and giant organised crime rings, like the kind of things that she was covering on Crimewatch were disappearances or home burglaries and stuff like that. It just didn't make much sense that someone would want to kill her over that. The kind of cases that were often featured on Crimewatch were not necessarily the kind of cases that involved people that could hire a hitman. You know what I mean? That is very much in the like organised crime underworld, not some lads that robbed a bakery the other week and now it's on the telly. But just because I personally think it's quite unlikely doesn't mean that this wasn't a theory, and quite a believed theory. And I'm sure a lot of you guys will actually resonate with this theory. You'll have to let me know down in the comments which theory you think is the most believable once we've covered them all. But if you're thinking this theory could be quite strong, then listen to this next part extra carefully. Essentially, there was an intelligence report from around that time, and before I tell you what was in it, I will tell you what an intelligence report is, because I remember when I was first getting into true crime, I was so confused by what intelligence is, and it's so vague for a reason. It is literally just information that the police collect from different sources, like informants, snitches. I think even things like witness reports can be considered like intelligence. I'm not sure. Not entirely sure, but basically I think it was from a snitch. But anyway, around the time of Jill's murder, police had received intelligence that there were 2 men from North London who seemed to have a motive to kill Jill. The reports suggest that she was being targeted because she presents Crimewatch, and it even describes how and where the murder weapon, the gun, was disposed of. Unfortunately, we don't know any more than that. The actual intelligence that they had will have been way, way, way more detailed than what I've just given you, but that is all we can find online because that intelligence was never looked into Why? For that reason, the report has never been made public. And we do know that at that time, DCI Campbell had left a note on that case that said no further action. He shut down that lead. It wasn't just that they didn't have time or resources or energy to look into it. It was that he actively closed it. And it's very frustrating to hear that a potentially quite promising lead was shut down because Campbell was just too tunnel vision with what he wanted to believe that he couldn't give time to other angles. This is just one of many, many instances of careless or shallow police work in this case. But before I get all riled up about that, let's first talk about another theory that the police investigated, and this one is seriously terrifying. The way that Jill was killed makes you wonder if it was representative of more than just the act itself, more than just Jill's death. As we said before, it seems like someone is trying to send a message. The killing was so silent and precise, and it was something like out of a spy thriller. And there's something very sinister about that, because what if it wasn't just any old hitman hired to kill Jill Dando? What if it was an assassination from an international spy agent? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Eleanor Neale has finally lost it. Like, she's off the rocker. She's talking about shit that don't make sense. You've got to stick with me on this one, because this theory does sound really weird off the bat. With peace and love to my researcher, I think this has sent her crazy in the last couple of weeks. But the more you get into it and the more facts you learn and the more things you put together, it does make a lot of sense, so let's dig into it. The theory goes that Jill Dando was the target of a Serbian sleeper agent in London that was ordered to kill her. These sleeper agents are supposed to just blend in and live a normal life and have normal friends and a normal job and shit like that until one day they will receive a call and it's like they're suddenly activated. And in that call, they will be given orders from their side of tasks to carry out in that country, and often they are violent attacks like assassinations. And that's not scary at all to think about, is it? That in London there are just like spies lurking in their shadows, biding their time, ready at any moment to assassinate someone. And I'm sure you're asking, well, why would Jill Dando be a target for an attack like this? It wasn't like she was an undercover spy or a diplomat. She was only a TV reporter. And when I say only, that's not to diminish it, it's just to mean that she was so harmless to everyone. How did she even attract the attention of a Serbian sleeper agent? Well, on April 6th, 1999, Jill made a public appeal on the BBC for aid for Kosovo Albanian refugees who were fleeing the horrors of the Yugoslav war. Honestly, you would need like a 6-part Netflix documentary series to understand like the full history of this conflict, so I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But at the time, what the world was seeing and what Jill was seeing was the absolute horrors and the devastation of war. Serbian troops were burning villages, terrorizing civilians. They forced over 650,000 people to flee Kosovo. And Jill couldn't just sit back and watch this. She knew that she had to do something. She was such an empathetic person, and she knew that she had a gift of a platform. She had a voice. People cared what Jill Dando had to say, and so she knew she wanted to try and make a difference here. So she got on the BBC and made this plea, in which she described this as a massive humanitarian crisis, saying these refugees have been walking for days. By the time they arrive, they're dehydrated, hungry, exhausted, and cold. And throughout this news clip, they were showing images and videos of like children crying and people being wheeled away who were like too weak and too cold to be able to walk anymore. Jill knew she had to say something. She knew she had to appeal to as many people as she possibly could for help. But she also knew that taking that kind of stand on such a political issue, I guess, could be dangerous. Because Jill was speaking out against this, it's possible that she could have caught the attention of some very dangerous people in Serbia that didn't like what she was saying, didn't like the idea that this woman from Britain might have influence. It is likely that they could have seen Jill Dando as a threat. After Jill's appeal on the BBC, things started escalating very quickly with this war. and stick with me. I'm about to give you a lot of information in a short space of time, but it's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through it together. On April 23rd, NATO gets involved. Now, if you don't already know, NATO is a military alliance that was created after World War II. And in 1999, at the time of this case, there were 19 countries that were a part of it, including the UK. So NATO comes in and actually bombs a Serbian TV station, killing 16 journalists. And this happened just 3 days before Jill, also a TV presenter, was murdered. The reason that NATO targeted that TV station was because it was actually owned and operated by the president of Serbia. And it was targeted because it was seen as the main source of Serbian government propaganda. So, could it be possible that after this bombing, Serbia was looking to seek revenge on a NATO member country? The UK was one of the most powerful members of NATO at that point in time, and they played a very big role in the conflict. So I guess this put a target on the UK for retaliation attacks. It's possible that the assassination of Jill Dando was Serbia's way of getting back at the UK for what they did. At this point in time in 1999, Jill Dando was probably the most well-known face on TV, which essentially just made her the face of the UK, or of the news especially, and I guess that's what they cared about the most. So was her death an eye for an eye? A journalist for a journalist, or 16? It's horrifying to think about, but it's hard not to make that connection. In the beginning of the investigation, police took this potential Serbian connection very, very seriously, and they were actually really worried that other British TV presenters might also be in danger. And this was only proven when, in the days after Jill's murder, a series of death threats were made against other BBC journalists. There were 2 calls made to the BBC TV centre 3 days after Jill's murder, and this anonymous caller was threatening to kill 4 other female journalists. The message said, from Serbia, going to kill Anne Robinson and Alice Beer and 2 others. Anne Robinson and Alice Beer were, of course, BBC presenters at the time. They were both on a show called Watchdog, which has a similar vibe to Crimewatch. Watchdog basically looked into problems that customers were having with businesses, and the show helped to hold those businesses responsible and accountable for the way that they treat their customers, if that makes sense. It basically aims to inform the public of different things, engage them, and seek justice, I guess, just like Crimewatch. But that wasn't the only threat that was made against Alice Beer. She had actually received a letter a good couple of weeks before Jill Dando's murder that was threatening her again, this time a physically written letter, and Jill got one too. And the contents of these letters were horrifying, so creepy. The writer was detailing how they wanted to abduct the women, capture them, and rape them. So this is huge, right? Jill Dando had received a threatening letter that said someone wanted to harm her, someone wanted to act violence on her, and then a couple of weeks later, she's shot dead. I also just find it very interesting that there seems to be someone out there that has a very strange and dangerous, scary obsession with British female TV presenters. When Alice heard about Jill's murder, she was shocked, horrified, devastated, everything that her other co-workers were, but Alice especially, because she had got very similar threats. They had received the same threats. So now Alice was fearing for her life, and she really thought that police were going to be with her within the hour to talk about these letters, because obviously that must be a lead, right? Turns out, no, police didn't really see it as a lead, and they never went and spoke to Alice about these letters, which maybe they didn't need to, but Alice found it very strange that that wasn't even a line of inquiry. And me too, Alice. I think that's strange too, girl. Alice was quite frustrated because it seems like there is a pattern. This person is stalking TV presenters and has just killed their first one. Who is to say that they're not going to keep going until they've killed all the TV presenters in the UK? Or at least killed all the female ones that they have been writing these threatening letters to. To me, there's kind of like two theories in one here. I kind of forgot that we were still talking about the Serbian link, because to me, this does also kind of sound like an obsessive fan, like a stalker fan. You know those kind of obsessive stalker fans that can't quite figure out if they love or hate the person? Do you remember the Freaky Friday video that we did on Bjork's stalker? He claimed that he loved Bjork, wanted to marry her, but then he goes and makes this letter bomb and sends it to her house to kill her. Like, what? Obviously, we're never going to be able to put ourselves in the heads of these people because they're not in their right minds. But even still, I can't even see like a twisted logic there. Maybe the kind of like, if I can't have you, no one can. But I don't really get that vibes from the Jill Dando case. But I do get that vibe from the threatening letters, especially the letters detailing like rape fantasies that were sent specifically for Jill and Alice. But maybe that's a little theory in itself, that it was a BBC TV presenter fanboy that had a few screws loose. I don't know. But back to the Serbian connection. You're not going to believe this. Or maybe you are, because this is DCI Campbell we're talking about. He actually ruled out the possibility of a Serbian connection and didn't give much reason as to why he ruled that out. Maybe there's not a huge amount of evidence for it, but I would also say there's not a huge amount of evidence against it either. Nothing more than the other theories that we've got. And surely he knew that shutting down a lead like that would just be like striking a match under conspiracy theorists. Doesn't it sound a bit like a suspicious government cover-up? Things getting ruled out and no reasons for it. After all, the Serbian president at the time wasn't beyond doing things like this, murdering a random British woman to make a message. Earlier that same month, a Serbian journalist and a fierce critic of the president was shot to death outside of his house. He was killed in retaliation for him speaking out against the regime, and it wasn't until over 20 years later that 4 Serbian spies, yes, trained spies, were convicted of his murder. The president had sent spies to go and shoot someone on their doorstep. Doesn't this sound exactly like the story of Jill Dando? And we've seen enough on this channel to know that very rarely things are just coincidences. And the idea that Jill was murdered by some Serbian sleeper agent isn't too far-fetched. I mean, some of the crime scene evidence can actually support it. For example, on the bullet casing, someone had made like 6 tiny little holes all the way around it. They were very precise and, again, very, very tiny. So someone must have done it by hand. This isn't like the work of a big machine that's mass producing them. This was very unusual. Certainly not something that you find often in the UK. So where did a bullet like that come from? Well, this type of crimped cartridge was typically manufactured in Russia and found in the Balkans. And Serbia is in the Balkans. So, let's imagine for a second that this theory is true. Jill Dando was assassinated by a Serbian sleeping agent in London. Sleeping agent? Sleeper agent. They're just very tired. If that was true, that would look very bad for the British government. That, first of all, they'd like let that happen, that they weren't super tight on things like that. It would be a bit embarrassing. And let's be honest, all of the citizens of this country would be terrified. The British government could never admit to their people that a foreign president had the power to order an assassination of a national treasure like Jill Dando right on her own doorstep. So in that case, maybe it was easier, safer even, for the government to let this theory fade slowly into whispers of conspiracy. So that is why a lot of people think that the Serbian link was ruled out quite quickly. I don't know, what do you think? But anyway, as the weeks turned into months, there was still no arrest in sight, and the British press were becoming unbearable for the police. They were demanding developments and updates, and they just couldn't understand why the police weren't making progress, weren't cracking this case. So much so that the journalists actually started going out and doing their own detective work. They were knocking on doors in Jill's neighbourhood, trying to uncover any pieces of new evidence that they thought the police might have missed. And don't get me wrong, this wasn't to help Jill or to help the investigation or to seek justice. This was just so that they could get a new headline, because police weren't bringing in updates quick enough. They needed to go out and get themselves. Basically, at this point in time, it seemed like the police weren't doing shit. Although they swore that they were just drawing blanks. Like, there were no leads, there were no suspects. They just kept going around in circles, but they insisted that they were really trying. I beg to differ, though. Personally, I beg to fucking differ. We've been really mad at the police work in this case. I mean, this happens often in the Eleanor Neale writing room, but yeah, this one especially, DCI Campbell is not a friend of the channel. In this case, police lost so many opportunities to question or investigate witnesses. A document from the case file lists over 380 potential suspects, and over 100 of those potential suspects were never even approached by the police. What do you mean you're going to call them a potential suspect and then just leave them to get on with things? A second document in the case file revealed that on the morning of Jill's death, 11 different people were seen kind of in that area, and none of those 11 were identified or questioned by the police. And that's like what? The long coat man, the fella in the blue Range Rover, do you remember Shouty Pants? There were so many witnesses that they knew were there based on people's descriptions, but they were never able to like actually figure out who that person was and speak to them. And to me, it's just incredibly frustrating and weird that so many potential suspects were left as a question mark in this case. Like, they weren't even ruled out. They were just kind of there, and police weren't doing anything. And those police were running out of time to provide answers for the public. It had been almost a full year since the murder of Jill Dando, and still no one had been charged, and they were no closer to having a true suspect. At this point, DCI Campbell realised that their methods were not working. And it really took him a whole fucking year to figure that out, really. But at this point, the police were a year behind in their investigation, and something needed to change fast. And that was when they started to fixate on the idea that it could have been a crazy stalker fan. I got a bit ahead of myself earlier, didn't I? Wow, we get to talk about that now. Of course, Jill was a celebrity, and like many celebrities, she had two parts to her life, her private life and her public life that everyone saw. But for someone that is very obsessed with a celebrity, they want those lines to blur. They try to blur those lines. They try to get in contact with the person or follow them or find out their address. And this is crazy stalker people, by the way, not just like fans. Please don't do this with anyone that you're a fan of. It's creepy and weird and illegal, actually. But again, calling back to the video that we did on Bjork's stalker, he was always trying to find out shit about that woman. Like, the fact that he did actually managed to send a bomb to her address in London means he found out her whole entire address. And he nearly killed her with it as well. He did. He made a bomb, sent it to her house, and the only reason she didn't die is, thank God, the police intercepted it. It got all the way to the post office in London from like America or Canada. Anyway, nowhere near, from a different continent, this fucking bomb had travelled, gotten to London, and finally then police managed to intercept it before it got to Bjork's house. But she could have died. She almost died because of a stalker fan. And police worried that this is exactly what had happened to Jill Dando. Someone had formed this crazy obsession with her to the point where, I don't know. Again, I said this earlier, like, I don't really know why obsessed stalker fans want to kill the person. Like, I can't relate. I love Ariana Grande so much, but if I killed her, I wouldn't get another album. So, police decided to call in help to create a criminal profile of their killer, which is basically where they analyse the killer's behaviours and their choices based on the crime that they've committed, and through that, they can figure out what kind of person the killer might be. For example, if the murder was done with someone's bare hands, then that could probably tell you that your killer is quite physically strong. Even like the time that a murder was committed could tell you a lot about the killer's like working hours, their lifestyle, when they sleep. Like, it gets really interesting, and it can get really specific as well. Although, this one wasn't that specific, but it was still decent. The profile that was created of Jill's killer said that they probably ticked a couple of the following boxes. They were either an infatuated psychopath, a loner who doesn't get out much, a stalker who can't let go of Jill, or a superfan who was obsessed with her. I feel like a super hater could also be lumped in with that category. And at this point in time, this seemed pretty promising, and the theory that it was a professional hitman was slowly slipping away. The police never even had any hard evidence to prove that in the first place. But it wasn't long after police had completely abandoned that hitman theory that a name appeared on their desk, Mr. Barry Balsaro. And this wasn't brand new information, actually. Barry Balsaro had been said to police a couple of times in the beginning of this case, but again, they never looked into it. But there were a couple of different people that brought that name up to the police. So let's talk about those. Why do we think Barry Balsara is a suspect? The first report they got of this Barry Balsara was actually just a couple of hours after the murder of Jill Dando. He was in the area and he was acting very weird and agitated. The call that they got was from someone that owned a local business, and I think Barry had been into their business and acted weird and then left and was still acting weird on the street outside, and so this person thought, okay, maybe I should be calling the police about this is weird. Well, it turns out after he left that location, the crazy only continued. He kept walking around in town until he tried to get a free taxi ride from a cab company called London Traffic Cars. Which, like, side note, if you're a taxi company and you want me to choose your service over everyone else's, maybe don't put the word traffic in your name. That's not gonna make me think I'm gonna get there very fast. London Traffic Cars, anyway, ended up calling the police about Barry Balsara because not only was he asking for a free taxi ride and like, no, this is a business, bro. But he was also just being that same weirdness that he was before. He was very agitated. He seemed desperate to leave the area, but he had no money on him. It was a very weird situation. And everyone that crossed his path that day thought so, to the point where they all called the police. All two of them, by the way. I don't know why I'm saying all when it did only happen twice. But it's weird that it happened twice, right? But it gets even weirder, right? The next day, someone from London Traffic Cars calls the police again with even more information, because it seems that Barry Balsara had gotten back in touch with the taxi company to try to set up a fake alibi for that day. Barry had gone back to this taxi company and asked an employee if they could verify that he, Barry, was there yesterday. And they even asked if they remembered what he was wearing. Bear in mind that the day that he's trying to get an alibi for is the day of Jill's murder. He actually rang up later that day, so he left the taxi rank satisfied with his answers, but then he rang up again asking if they could give him the exact time that he was at the taxi rank the day before. He said that it was for his solicitor. What is going on here? And you know what? Police didn't bother looking into him at all when they got all these reports. I don't know, to me that is quite an immediate suspect. Someone acting really sketchy and agitated in the area and desperately trying to get away from the area and then trying to set up an alibi. It's absolutely infuriating to me that police didn't bother looking into this at the time of Jill's murder. They received 3 phone calls about a weird guy in the area and just didn't look into it? Why? And it is just infuriating because a year into this case, remember that's where we're at now, I had to time travel back for you for a second. But at this point, they're a year out, they've wasted so much time on leads that haven't gone anywhere, and now they're like, yeah, do you remember that Barry Balsara guy from right in the beginning? Maybe we should look into that. After a whole entire year! But they did find out rather quickly that it was going to be hard to look into Barry Balsara because Barry Balsara doesn't exist. It was a fake name, it was an alias. His name was actually just Barry George, and that made me laugh in my research because it reminded me of Barry Scott, Still It Bang. Barry George was born in London in 1960, which makes him just 1 year older than Jill. He'd had a rough childhood. His parents divorced when he was young, his dad moved to Australia, you know, the usual. By the age of 14, he was sent to a boarding school for children that have emotional and behavioural issues. But other than that, there was nothing more really to note about his childhood. There were no major red flags in his childhood, really. But unfortunately, the same can't be said for his adulthood, because police quickly found out that this guy had a criminal record. And not just for anything, for attempted rape and impersonating a police officer, but I'm not really as interested in that. Honestly, even though attempted rape doesn't make him a killer, certainly doesn't fucking look good, does it? That he doesn't respect other people or their bodies or their lives and their consent, and I don't know. It's just showing me what kind of person this is. So of course, the major reasons that police suspect Barry George, sorry, I am going to call him Barry George now because that is his real name. The reasons police thought it could be him was obviously all those suspicious sightings on the day of Jill's murder, but there was actually more than that. Now that they were properly looking into this guy, they realised that he had an obsession, a fixation on Princess Diana, who is Jill Dando's doppelganger. They look identical. ish. But his fixation on Diana wasn't like normal fan behavior. It wasn't, you know, like the posters on the walls and like changing your surname to their surname on social media. Do you remember when people used to do that? I'm not gonna lie to you, my Spotify username is still Eleanor Fuentes because I love Vic Fuentes from Pierce the Veil. Imagine like Barry Diana written in his diary. But anyway, as I was saying, this wasn't any normal fan, not even a super fan. He was disgusting. There was one occasion that he was actually detained on the grounds of Kensington Palace, which is where Princess Diana lived. He was found in a bush, hiding, with a mask on and a hunting knife in one hand, rope in the other hand. What the fuck was he gonna do to Princess Diana? If Barry could have such a twisted, dangerous fixation on Princess Diana, then what's there to say that that fixation didn't transfer onto Jill Dando when Diana was killed? I mean, when she died. Barry George lived in a flat on his own on Crookham Road in Fulham, which was just a 10-minute walk away from where Jill lived on Gowan Avenue. Barry was known locally as a bit of a loner, someone that didn't have many friends, was socially awkward. He was a lonely, frustrated person. He was basically ticking every box on police's list. Do you remember that criminal profile that they made up? That he was like an obsessed stalker, a loner, tick, tick, tick. So, feeling pretty confident that they had their guy, DCI Campbell went and authorised a search warrant for Barry's flat. And what they found in there was beyond disgusting. His flat was a total dump. There was rubbish everywhere. There were ants all over the floor. And if that wasn't revolting enough, police officers also found feces in multiple places in that flat. I'm really sorry if any of you were eating while listening to this episode. You're probably not anymore. But one of the key pieces of evidence that they found in his flat were rolls and rolls and rolls of undeveloped film. And they knew that they had to get them developed because this could be potential evidence, but boy, they did not want to do it. They were scared to see what could possibly be on this film. And honestly, they were right to be disturbed because this whole roll of photos, hundreds and hundreds of them, they were just sneaky snaps that Barry had taken of random women out in public. He had been stalking women repeatedly, taking these photos and collecting them, saving them. And police even found notes in his bedroom of different women's names and addresses or phone numbers, car registrations that he had put alongside them. And I'm honestly going to guess that it's not because these women were giving over this information. This is all notes that he has probably taken down from stalking different women. There was another roll of film developed as well that showed pictures of him with guns and wearing masks and stuff. Barry was clearly a big gun guy, like not in terms of muscles, but in terms of he really liked guns. There were gun magazines all over his flat. Police found an old holster for a firearm. At this point in time, DCI Campbell was completely convinced that Barry George was their killer, but the search of his flat didn't reveal any direct evidence that linked him to Jill's murder. What the search did uncover, though, was a long, dark trench coat in his wardrobe, matching the description of that guy that was seen like fleeing from Jill's area on the morning of her murder. So the coat was sent for a forensic analysis, and guys, they found a single gunshot residue particle in the pocket of this coat. In the inside jacket pocket as well, which makes it even more like mysterious to me, as if like they were really hiding the gun in the inside pocket. And this single gunshot residue particle matched the residue that was found at the scene of Jill's murder, in her hair, on the cartilage. This was evidence that you can't really refute, or at least they thought that you couldn't. And so with that, police really thought they had him, and they brought Barry George in for a questioning. It appeared to police that Barry George wasn't being completely truthful in his interviews. He was very cooperative, but he seemed to contradict himself a lot, as if he couldn't get his story straight. Initially, he claimed that he didn't own any guns, he wasn't a gun guy, but then he later admitted to owning 2. But he insisted that they only fire blank ammunition. I mean, that is a bit of a jump, isn't it? He also claimed to the police that he had no idea who Jill Dando was. What, like the biggest celebrity in your country? One of the biggest celebrities in your country? You don't know who she is? Her face is on your TV every single day. I mean, I guess it's not impossible that he'd never heard of Jill Dando, but I think it's very, very unlikely. And he has already been caught lying in his police interview, so I don't know. But one thing that I do need to let you know about Barry George is that as he was doing all of this police interview stuff, he was given a psychiatric assessment and he was diagnosed with Asperger's for the first time in his whole entire life. Asperger's is a term that we don't really use anymore. It's like an old diagnostic term. It basically means that he had autism. He was on the autistic spectrum, and this was never identified in his whole entire life. Although he was sent to a school for people that had like learning difficulties, I guess. I'm not entirely sure the specifics of what he was there for and what kind of things he was getting help with, but I just find that very interesting that he'd gone through his whole life without being diagnosed with autism, and it only came up during this trial. And the reason I bring this up at this point is because he had done all of these police interviews, like questioning and stuff, all on his own. He didn't have a lawyer, and that is crazy, by the way. Never talk to police without a legal representative right there. I just think that we have to bear in mind that this person that definitely needed a legal representative and probably needed some support in that moment from someone that understood Asperger's as it was then, but he didn't have any of that. It was just him and a couple of police officers that were grilling him. So I guess maybe that could be how some of the inconsistencies have come in. I really think that he should have had a lot more support. He should have had people sitting there with him, helping him through this process. But anyway, as Barry George was like in and out of the police station for questioning, DCI Campbell himself actually went on Crimewatch to talk about Jill Dando's case and appeal to the public for more answers. How unsettling is that? That they are discussing the murder of a lady that used to stand right where they are standing, presenting that exact show, and now she has become a case on her own crime show. Totally fine, guys. I'm not going to have nightmares after this. It's totally fine. The police felt like it was very important for them to go on to Crimewatch to explain this new theory to the public, that it seemed like Jill was killed by a stalker or some like obsessed fan. Even though Barry was already being questioned by the police and he was being very cooperative, they decided that Crimewatch was worth doing anyway, just in case anyone watching might have had like supporting circumstantial evidence that they could call in about. They did make sure not to mention Barry or any specific suspects when they were talking on Crimewatch so that it wouldn't like influence anything. I'm not entirely sure what came of Crimewatch. Maybe there were some tips that we've kind of integrated into the rest of this video, but I don't know. Don't really have much to tell you from there. Clearly though, things weren't working, things weren't going very fast, and so the police decided to use another questionable tactic. DCI Campbell sent an undercover cop to go and cozy up to Barry at an internet cafe in London, and they were going to try to pull some information out of him. This is known as a honey trap operation, where an undercover officer pretends to be a friend or a romantic interest to a suspect in order to extract information from them. The idea was to get close to Barry and then bring up particular topics of conversation where he might slip up and admit that he's a really big fan of Jill Dando, or yeah, he was in the area in Fulham on the morning of the murder. Different things like that. But unfortunately, this is yet another lead that went cold. Nothing happened with the honey trap operation. Barry never admitted anything, never said anything. It was wasted time. But what this honey trap operation tells me, personally, I think that the police already had it in their heads of what they wanted to find from this operation. They wanted a loner. They wanted a weirdo. And they wanted that loner weirdo to be Barry George so that they could just lock him up and be done with this case, in my opinion. I actually think they wanted it to be Barry George so bad that they had to start bending things to make him fit the narrative. There was barely any compelling evidence to arrest and convict Barry, but did that even matter? As we've seen before, the police can literally just make up evidence if they so want to. I mean, obviously that's illegal. They can't just do that. Like, that's not part of the police rules, but Police go by their own rules, don't they, hey? And now, the biggest update of the case this whole entire time, 369 days into the investigation, the police charged Barry George with the murder of Jill Dando. But did they really believe this? Like, really? Or had the police just turned this weird, kind of creepy man into a suspect just to satisfy the press? We know full well that the pressure was mounting in the British police at this point in time. Maybe they felt they needed to just pin it on someone quickly, and no one really liked Barry anyway, so... And let's be honest, like, being realistic, for Barry to have actually pulled off this murder the way that it was, the stars would have had to align perfectly. Like, come on, no one noticed this fella walking around with a gun, no one noticed him walking around Gowan Avenue. He would have had to have arrived at the house at the exact right moment. Plus, how was he even gonna know that she was there? Again, this case is just always raising more questions than it's answering. And I think DCI Campbell and his team knew this. They felt the same way. They felt just as flustered as me trying to make sense of this, which is why I think they were scrambling to build a case against Barry George. And to do this, they ordered for another criminal profile to be made, which is just such an odd use of their time at this point, since they're pretty sure that they've got their guy. A criminal profile is of most use when you have no idea who you're looking for. It helps to narrow down the pool a little bit. But in this case, they already thought they knew who that was, so why did they need that criminal profile making again? Could it be because they wanted one that aligned almost perfectly with the traits that Barry George possessed, so that they could use this as evidence? It's almost as if this other criminal profile was made solely to support the narrative that police had arrested the right person. Maybe because there wasn't much other evidence to support this arrest anyway. And that's not how that is supposed to work, by the way. In fact, there's even a term for this. It's called self-supporting evidence. It's when your so-called evidence only serves to justify the conclusion that you've already jumped to, rather than guiding an unbiased investigation. And this is a pretty serious problem when you start creating a profile after you've already got a suspect arrested, because surely the profile is just going to be, like... It's not supposed to happen that way around. This is literally making up your own evidence, isn't it? But regardless, Barry's murder trial began in February 2001, almost 2 years after Jill's murder. The trial lasted 52 days in total, and after hearing all of that evidence, the jury deliberated for 5 days. When they finally returned, several of the jury members looked visibly distraught. Some of them were even crying as they re-entered the courtroom. And you could cut the tension in that courtroom with a knife. No one knew which way the verdict might go. But on July 2nd, 2001, Barry George was found guilty of the murder of Jill Dando, and he was sentenced to life in prison. In the end, the piece of evidence that sealed Barry's fate was that single particle of gunshot residue that was found inside the pocket of his coat. But bear with me, because this story doesn't actually end with Barry's conviction. Famously, the police in this case made a lot of fatal mistakes. Wink. As we know from the Serbian connection that we spoke about earlier, there's a real possibility that Jill's death was about more than just the act itself. And after Barry was sentenced, the police received a letter that suggested that this might be true. And this wasn't just any letter. It was a confession to Jill Dando's murder. And it wasn't written by Barry George. It was actually written by a man that was already a convicted killer at that point in time. His name was Wayne Aird. At the time, he was serving a life sentence for murdering his flatmate, which happened just 2 months after Jill Dando's murder. So the timeline matches up. This letter that the police received was long. It was 10 pages long, so I'm gonna try my best to condense that shit for you. And in this letter, Wayne Aird claims that he is a part, or was a part, of an IRA cell. The IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, was an armed resistance organisation that believed all of Ireland should be independent, an independent country free from British colonial rule. And Wayne claimed in this letter to the police that senior members of the IRA had chosen chosen Jill as a target because of her connections to the police through her work with Crimewatch. Wayne also confessed in this letter to being part of an establishment cover-up. Those are the words he used. He claimed that the British government basically allowed the IRA to get away with Jill Dando's murder just to avoid breaking the Northern Ireland peace process. So police received this corker of a letter, this 10-page manifesto that does seem quite interesting, doesn't it? I'm actually not entirely sure if Wayne himself was trying to confess to this murder or if he was saying he knew who had done it and he knew all this inside information. Either way, police didn't bother fucking looking into it, so I guess that's why we don't know. Oh, it infuriates me, guys. Why don't they look into anything, especially in this case? Why are they ignoring such interesting evidence? I guess at this point in time, they did already have a conviction. Barry George was behind bars, and if police were to admit that this was compelling evidence and they were to look into it, then that would have to be them admitting that they were wrong, or even thinking that they could be wrong. And that doesn't make the police look very confident. It wouldn't give people a lot of faith in their decisions and in their convictions if they've already convicted a murderer and they're like, but hang on, what if it's the wrong guy? Should we keep looking at the evidence? Everyone's gonna be like, what do you mean? After a year in prison, Barry actually made his first appeal to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to try and get his conviction overturned. So he goes to court and they do this whole hearing where they go back over all the evidence and they just kind of told him to shut up. They said that the evidence all still held up and Barry deserved to be behind bars. So off he went back to his prison cell. So let's talk about that evidence for a second, shall we? We have already spoken about it, specifically that single particle of gunshot residue inside his pocket, which, by the way, was found in a coat in his wardrobe over a year after Jill was murdered. It's crazy that a particle from over a year ago could still be on a coat that you just have in your wardrobe. I don't know. Gunshot residue, by the way, if you don't know what it is, I'm sorry that I haven't explained this earlier. Basically, when a gun goes off, residue also comes off it, and if you're in the area or if you touch a gun or anything like that, you're gonna get it all over you, girl. The particles explode out of the muzzle and they can land, well, they usually land on the shooter, on the person or the object that's getting hit, and like, I don't know, like surrounding areas. But usually when this happens, there are a lot of gunshot residue particles. If you're near the gun, you're gonna be kind of covered in it. So one singular particle on the inside of a pocket in his coat, I don't know, that is tiny. And this isn't actually a clear sign of Barry George's guilt, because did you know that particles can be transferred accidentally? Wow, who would have thought it? Get me a science degree. So for example, if someone shoots a gun in the morning, don't know why they're doing that, but they're doing it, and then they go and get on the London Underground, they ride the tube a couple of stops and then they get off, and then I get on and sit in their exact seat, there's a good chance I now have gun residue on me from where it's come off of them onto the seat and then gone from the seat onto me. If that could get me put away in prison for murder, oh my God. That is really, really scary to think about. And a lot of people believe that this is what happened to Barry George. A few years later, Barry made another appeal and went through that whole process again, and this time, someone with sense was in the room. This time, the commission found that there was way too much importance put on this single particle of residue. And we actually have a stat for you. Often 1 in 100 people pick up a stray particle of gunshot residue without even knowing it. And that is not even that rare. 1 in 100? It's probably happened to us all at some point in time, surely. In this day and age, in 2024, forensic teams don't give much weight to individual particles anymore for this exact reason. But unfortunately, at the time, in the early 2000s, they didn't quite know that yet. So when the commission found out how much weight was put on this singular particle, they thought that this case should go for a retrial, and that happened in 2007. In the original trial that actually got him put down for murder, there was a ballistics expert brought up to talk about this gunshot residue, and they said that it looked like Barry was the one that had shot the gun. But now the commission was finding that that wasn't necessarily the case. You don't need to shoot the gun yourself to have a bit of residue on you. Remember the tube? And in his appeal, it was stated that if all of this was said in the first trial, that like a singular gunshot particle could actually get on you from other means, then maybe the jury wouldn't have voted to put him in prison. Eventually, after spending 8 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, on August the 1st, 2008, Barry George was found not guilty of the murder of Jill Dando, and he was released from prison. Which is good news for Barry, awful fucking news that he had to spend 8 years in prison where everyone thinks he's a murderer. But I'm so glad to hear that he was listened to and that he's now out. But unfortunately, since Barry George, no one else has been brought forward as a suspect in the Jill Dando murder case. Although there have been more and more theories as the years have been going by, and they just get wilder and wilder. One of the most shocking theories that we came across was that her murder case might have been part of a massive cover-up at the BBC. Allegedly. But this massive cover-up at the BBC is all to do with none other than Jimmy fucking Savile. Jimmy Savile was once a beloved BBC presenter. In fact, I think a lot of people at the time would have gone so far to say that he was a national treasure. Everyone loved that man, kids and adults alike. But after his death, Jimmy Savile's reputation was blown to smithereens when it was exposed that he was a serial sexual abuser. He abused mostly children and young women. An absolutely sick and disgusting man that has become like a stain on early British TV. Like I said, so many people considered him a national treasure. So many families trusted him with their children. They took them on his show. Those revelations are genuinely one of the biggest things that has rocked this country in the 21st century. I would say that. But where's the Jill Dando connection? Well, I was just getting to that. In 2012, when the Jimmy Savile scandal broke, rumours started floating around that Jill might have known about a paedophile ring that was operating inside the BBC during the 90s. The theory is that Jill was murdered because people were trying to silence her. Maybe she knew about Jimmy. Maybe she'd even threatened to tell people or to go to the police. Maybe she even threatened to expose the BBC for helping him, allegedly, maybe. I don't know, you can kind of decide yourself if there's much merit to that. I don't think so. But I will tell you at the end what theory I personally believe. Another theory that I found like kind of interesting, but not interesting enough to spend any more than like 30 seconds talking about, is that it could have been a case of mistaken identity. This theory thinks that Jill's murderer was trying to kill a different TV presenter, but he got it wrong. He mistook Jill for this other woman, shot and killed her. But I'll be honest, Jill doesn't look like this other presenter that he supposedly mistook her for. I don't know. I don't believe that one personally. And now we're getting into more recent stuff. I want to tell you about a story from 2023. So literally just last year. This isn't a theory when it comes to Jill Dando's murder. Or maybe it could be linked in with one of the theories, but anyway. Let me explain. In the UK, there is a forensic psychologist named Kerry Danes who has been featured in a lot of different documentaries, like true crime documentaries on the British TV. Kerry is quite well known for what she does. She's a recognisable face. Well, one of the most recognisable faces when it comes to like British true crime documentaries. That is quite a niche thing to be famous in, but hey, you and me both, sister. Well, one day, Kerry Danes arrived home after a normal day out, or so she thought, and when she went into her garden, she saw the words Jill Dando scrawled on her garden fence, and her pet cat was found dead at the end of her garden. Someone had broken its neck. How fucking horrifying is that? It made my stomach turn when I first read. And Kerry genuinely believes that whoever did this was using Jill's name as a threat. And the message was very clear, like, watch yourself, watch what you're saying, or you will end up like Jill Dando. Unfortunately, in the BBC documentary about Jill's life, DCI Campbell says that he doesn't believe there will ever be any justice for Jill's murder. He doesn't think that anyone else will ever stand trial, like this is just it now. This is just one of the great unsolved cases of this country. But the story doesn't end there. Again, I've done this twice. We actually have some very, very new information that literally only came out last month, and this is why I wanted to do this case so quickly. Literally, all the team were sat together in the office and we saw this news and we were like, okay, Jill Dando next. Get that next up on the case list. On April 23rd, 2024, literally just a few weeks ago, a new suspect emerged in this case, and it's not anyone that we've spoken about so far. It was, however, a Serbian hitman who was working for the regime. And I'll tell you what, he does bear a striking similarity to the E-Fit sketch that they made of who they believe could have killed Jill Dando. I'm not gonna lie, I did kind of doubt the validity of this sketch in the first place, since there were no eyewitnesses, and I don't know, I feel like they were just making a sketch of a man. They didn't really know what he looked like. But they say that this man matches the sketch. He fits all of the general criteria that they thought this man would have been in his like 30s or 40s at the time. I don't know. It's quite basic that though, isn't it? But I'll tell you what the kicker is when it comes to this theory, because if it was bullshit, I wouldn't mention it in my video. But this man, his name is Milorad Ulemek. Sorry for that pronunciation. But this man is already in jail right now for murdering 2 former Serbian presidents. This man is serious shit. This fucker is a hitman through and through. And one of these Serbian presidents that he'd killed was murdered in exactly the same way as Jill Dando. A gun to the back of the head. So could this really be it? Like, is this the breakthrough that we've been waiting 25 years for? Have we actually found Jill Dando's murderer? I really, really hope the police are all over this lead and they take it seriously, because it's been 25 years and she deserves justice. As much as the rest of the country is still intrigued and want answers, above all, Jill Dando deserves justice. I am going to be totally honest with you guys in the end of this video that I don't know what I believe. I don't know what I believe. Probably the Serbian hitman one. Like, if I had to choose one, that one does seem the most watertight. But even then, it's not watertight, is it? None of them are watertight, and that is the issue. That is why I'm really struggling to like pick a side, because I could poke holes in every single one of these theories that we've just said, and that is unfortunately the exact reason why this case is still unsolved. I always get so frustrated when I finish an unsolved video and I like don't have an answer to give you. I'm like, come on, police, sort it. But thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed. Thanks again to listening.com for sponsoring this episode. Remember, when you go to listening.com/Eleanor Neale, or if you click the link down below in the description, you'll get an extra week for free. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below or leave us a comment. Let us know in the comments which theory you identify with the most, because I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna steal all you guys' answers. I'm gonna cheat on the test because I do not know myself. Try and convince me, actually. Try and get me on your side with the theories in the comments. I'm really excited. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be one on screen right now. Or if you want to subscribe to my channel, click the little circle with my face in. I post new videos every single week, and I want to see you here next week. Bye!